Water is a precious and limited resource. It makes up 60% of our bodies, and while it covers 71% of the Earth's surface, only 0.5% of fresh water on the planet is attainable. Without water, life ceases to exist. The climate crisis transforms life-giving water into one of the biggest threats to Black lives. Climate change is causing extreme imbalances, from increased flooding, torrential rains, ice storms, and rising sea levels to drought-like conditions. As a result, major cities in the U.S. and around the world are struggling to provide water to their populations. More than 2 million Americans live without access to safe drinking water and sanitation. Flint, Detroit, Dallas, Houston, and Jackson are devastating examples of economic and climate disasters in our cities. In defense of Black lives, we are forced into the fight to protect access to water. This is why the Movement for Black Lives has created the Red, Black, and Green New Deal initiative. We will not sacrifice Black lives or accept false solutions that perpetuate unjust social and economic systems. Climate justice is racial justice.
Energy powers our advancement. Since the start of the Industrial Revolution, our society has been designed to depend on the energy provided by fossil fuels. The extraction and processing of oil, gas, and coal has created a climate crisis that disproportionately impacts Black and Indigenous communities. Burning fossil fuels has caused higher than average temperatures and more frequent extreme weather events globally. These climate changes have resulted in a higher level of energy consumption that strains already struggling systems. We want reliable, sustainable energy that does not damage the environment or produce harmful impacts on marginalized communities. Our approach should be to divest from fossil fuels and invest in sustainable, renewable energy infrastructures. Our government should be a proponent and facilitator of investments in all forms of sustainable, renewable energy. Because Black communities are the most impacted by climate change, any conversation about climate should center Black lives. This is why the Movement for Black Lives has created the Red, Black, and Green New Deal initiative. We will not sacrifice Black lives or accept false solutions that perpetuate unjust social and economic systems. Climate justice is racial justice.
Climate change threatens Black lives. Our nation's infrastructure, the roads and bridges that get us to safety, the pipelines and facilities that run basic services to our homes are all impacted by climate change. Our land, our very foundation is at stake. Every year, the cost of housing, food, and basic services increases. Meanwhile, few of us are able to establish the kind of generational wealth that would allow us to escape and recover from climate disasters, which are becoming more frequent and more extreme. Despite being the least responsible for causing this imbalance, we are the ones at risk. We are the ones left to die. Public lands and natural resources, Black communities, as well as the lands we occupy, must be protected and prepared for a new climate reality. This is why the Movement for Black Lives has created the Red, Black, and Green New Deal initiative. We will not sacrifice Black lives or accept false solutions that perpetuate unjust social and economic systems. Climate justice is racial justice.
And I'm certain it's worth working to heal up the planet and make a lasting shift. Whose world is this? Whose world is this one? You, me, we all gon' lift our voices and shift something. Whose world is this? Whose world is this one? You, me, we all gon' lift our voices.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Aya de Leon, and I'm on the faculty here at the University of California, Berkeley, African American Studies, and I am the creative director of Black Literature versus the Climate Emergency. It's my pleasure today to introduce the moderator for our nonfiction panel. So Valencia Gunder, or as most recognize her, V, has been called the modern day Fannie Lou Hamer. A Miami native, Valencia is the founder and co-director of the Smile Trust, Incorporated. She's also the national organizing lead of the Black Hive and the Red, Black, and Green New Deal, the climate justice formation of the Movement for Black Lives, and she's also an advocate in residence at Florida Memorial University. Though her organizing roots don't come out of the environmental movement, Valencia has led community climate conversations and spoken nationally on issues of sea level rise, emergency preparedness, climate gentrification, housing, and food safety. She founded the Community Emergency Outreach Center that assisted over 23,000 residents after Hurricane Irma. After Hurricane Dorian, Valencia and the Smile team expanded their emergency response outreach to the Global South with their One Bahamas program, providing rapid emergency response in the islands and assisting Bahamians seeking refuge in South Florida. After tragically losing her goddaughter, Jada Page, to gun violence, Valencia transformed her grief into action. Through a Soros Justice Fellowship, Valencia created a rapid response toolkit, LIFT, to help decrease police and intercommunity violence in Miami. Valencia, who is a returning citizen, played a leadership role in passing Amendment 4 in Florida, which restored the right to vote to 1.4 million Floridians. And she works alongside over 80 formerly incarcerated Black women, Dignity Florida, to change legislation to assist with decarcerating women in the state of Florida. Please join me in welcoming Valencia Gunder. And I'll be jumping off and let these three folks have their conversation.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Aya. It's always a pleasure to be in community with you and to be in deep relationship with you. And I am so excited, super, super excited to be in the space with Emily and Vanessa today. Some amazing activists, revolutionaries, and leaders in our movement. Again, my name is Valencia Gunder. Most folks just simply call me V. Feel free to call me that. I use she, her pronouns. And I'm going to take some time right now to introduce you all to these amazing panelists that will be joining us today. I am going to start with introducing Emily Rabatu. I got it right, Emily? Yes, we got it right. Emily is an essayist who is at the intersection of social and environmental justice. Since the publication of the 2018 IPCC report, she has been writing exclusively about the climate crisis. A contributing editor at Orion Magazine and a regular contributor to the New York Review of Books. Her bylines also include New York Magazine's The Cut, Lit Hub, Zora Magazine, and Greenpeace's website. Her work has recently been anthologized in Best American Science Writing and Best American Travel Writing, and is forthcoming in the Climate Theme Anthology, The World as We Know It. For the Kenyan Review, she is guest editing a climate themed issue titled Angry Mamas, out this summer. Y'all got to check it out this summer. Her third book, Lessons for Survival, is forthcoming from Holt in 2023. Emily resides in New York City and teaches creative writing in Harlem at City College, once known as the poor man's Harvard. Everybody welcome Emily. Also with us today is Vanessa Nakate. I got it right. Oh, yes, got it right. Vanessa is a climate activist. She was the first Fridays for Future Climate Activists in Uganda and founder of the Rise Up Climate Movement, a movement to amplify the voices of activists from Africa. Her work includes raising awareness of climate change, causes, and impacts. She spearheaded the campaign Save Congo Rainforest, which has spread to other countries in Africa and Europe. She is working on a project that involves the installation of solar and institutional stoves in schools. She was one of a handful of youth activists to speak at COP25 in Spain. Vanessa graduated with a degree in business administration and marketing from Makerere, I think I got it right, University Business School. Everybody take a moment and let's welcome Vanessa. I can't believe that I am in the space with you two amazing individuals. I am so honored to be here. So y'all cool? We could jump right into it?
Yes.
All right. So we are here in connection with Black Studies at UC Berkeley, where June Jordan founded the Poetry for the People program. June used to ask her students to articulate the purpose of their poems, not just what they want them to be, but what they wanted them to do in the world. Can you each talk for a couple of minutes about your writing about climate and what you wanted to accomplish in this world? Let's start with Vanessa.
Yes. Thank you so much, V. Hi, everyone. My name is Vanessa Nakate, and I am a climate justice activist from Uganda. And I am happy to be on this panel with Emily, and I appreciate and honor the work of all the women in this space right now. So in 2018, I started to do research about the challenges that were affecting the lives of the people in my community and in my country, Uganda. And when I realized that the climate crisis was one of those challenges and the greatest threat facing the lives of so many people at that time and right now, I decided to become a voice in the climate movement by studying the climate strikes in Uganda. In my country, with the rising global temperatures, we are seeing changes in weather patterns. We are seeing changes in the way farmers expect when rainfall is going to come. There are more extreme weather events like droughts, like landslides, like floods that are affecting so many people, that are affecting access to food for so many people, access to water. And this is not just happening in Uganda. This is happening across the African continent, which historically is responsible for less than 4% of global emissions. And yet so many Africans are suffering some of the worst impacts of the climate crisis. We saw recently the Eastern Africa drought that left more than 26 million people with no access to food, with no access to water. We saw the tropical storm Anna affect countries like Malawi, Madagascar, and leaving hundreds of people dead and thousands of property displaced. And just 2 weeks before actually the end of 2 weeks, we saw Cyclone Batsirai land again in Madagascar, leaving so many people dead and property destroyed, farms and schools destroyed. So the climate crisis is already ravaging vast parts of the African continent and leaving people with no food, with no housing, with no schools, because in the process, as schools close down, as families lose everything, children are also forced to drop out of school. So for us, the climate crisis is happening now. It's not something that is coming in the future. And because of the changes, we are seeing, losses and damages in different communities on the African continent, because there are things that we can't adapt to anymore. As communities face extreme droughts, they cannot adapt to starvation. They cannot adapt to extinction. They cannot adapt to the loss of cultures or identities or histories as the climate crisis escalates. But we are not silent. The young people across the African continent are not silent, and they are organizing and mobilizing to demand for climate justice, to demand for climate finance for the African countries, for African communities, for African voices. And we all know how in these spaces, so many of us from Africa have faced a challenge of, being listened to or being amplified and being platformed. But what we always say is that we are not stoppable. We are unstoppable, and we continue to speak up. And if we don't get the platform, we create it for ourselves. So the young people across the African continent continue to demand for climate justice. As the COP27 is going to be in Africa this year, it's important that we all unite as Africans to put a demand for climate finance to address the climate realities, the losses and damages that are already, affecting the African continent, because we need justice for Africa, because it is not responsible for the climate crisis. And in my writings, I recently wrote a book, A Bigger Picture, my first book, and I'm always asked what inspired me to write a book. And honestly, I never thought that I would write a book. Someone just approached me and said that I could actually write a book. I could put my story in a book and share my experiences. And I'm happy that I was able to, believe that I could write a book and share about the work that I'm doing, but not just my work, but the work of different activists. Because in A Bigger Picture, it goes beyond Vanessa, but it also talks about the work of the different activists across the African continent and across the world. I personally believe that every activist has a story to tell, and every story has a solution to give, and every solution has a life to change. But this will only be possible if voices are platformed and amplified. And also in A Bigger Picture, I talk about, how climate change is more than weather, how climate change is more than statistics, how climate change is more than data points, and how it's about the people. Many times people end on the statistics, but they never get to know what individuals, what families, what generations go through because of these disasters. So A Bigger Picture looks at a much more, personal, it looks at a much more personal way the climate crisis, affects people in different places. If people just talk about the droughts in A Bigger Picture, it will show you what droughts mean for communities, starvation, women having to work hard on the farms, women having to walk long distances. So it gives an intersectional lens of how climate change relates with other issues of life, like poverty eradication, like achieving zero hunger, like achieving gender equality in our communities. And it also talks about what people can do, because people always ask, what can I do? How can I, do something for my community, for the planet? So it talks about some of the things that I can mention is to, find that passion, find something that you want to do, because in the end, all these causes are interconnected. They're all, related. And for you to educate and learn from people and then speak out. So that is basically what A Bigger Picture is. And I hope that many people get to know about the work that, African activists are doing on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Vanessa. I'm going to pass it over to Emily.
Thank you, Vanessa. So impressed by your work and your voice. And I just want to say I'm really, really excited to be on this panel, and also excited to meet you, V. The two of you are incontrovertible activists. I think of myself as increasingly as a climate storyteller, as a climate writer, which in itself, I guess, could be described as a form of activism. Like Vanessa, who's much younger than me, I really started writing about this issue in 2018 after the IPCC report. I think that was a watershed moment for many people around the world in terms of an increasing understanding of the dire nature of this crisis and its urgency. Prior to that point, I was a fiction writer and a nonfiction writer who didn't touch on this subject, who didn't understand or comprehend the way that it was endangering my life, my children's lives, the life of the people in my community and in the broader world. And it shook me so much that it radicalized me into changing the subject of my attention entirely. So I would say, I'd like to speak to the question that you posed, V, about writing and our experience as writers. Vanessa's book is very important for the reasons she said, that it highlights and foregrounds her voice while also decentering herself as, the only voice. And with appreciation for the fact that part of Vanessa's mission is to amplify the voices of not only, her nation, Uganda, but also the continent in the larger global context of the conversation about the climate crisis. I also want to say that I feel my own writing and my own voice has special meaning when I speak as a mother, because I think everyone can respect the world over, no matter where they are in terms of political position, where they stand in terms of party line, respects the mama bear, right? The mother who, when you're walking in the woods and if you stumble across some bear cubs, look out. Because if their mother's nearby and she sees that you're messing with her children, she's going to attack you. Right. It's from that place that I feel compelled to write about this crisis, right? Like, because selfishly, but also on the most fundamental, spiritual and biological level, I want my children to survive. I want all children to survive, right? To have a shot. And so it's from that vantage point that I feel compelled to write and to reach an audience of other people who can understand and respect that position. So I'd like to speak just a little bit about some of the things I've written and why since 2018, and my strategies for structure, tone, research, content, and audience. So one thing that happened to me, Vanessa has been very clear with us about her position, where she's from. I should say also, I live and teach and parent in New York City. Specifically, I live and teach and parent in a poor community, which is predominantly Black and Latino, which has a lot of health disparities that are themselves environmental. So we see that climate crisis is a threat multiplier. That's how it's described, that it makes a lot of things that were already bad for poor people of color, who contribute, as Vanessa has said, often the least to this issue, the most. So, for example, in my community, more kids on average suffer from asthma because of poisoning infrastructure that's been placed in the community, right? More people died of coronavirus, of COVID, because of deep health disparities. And so I started noticing, just walking from, my apartment building in Upper Manhattan to my teaching position at the City College of New York, which is in Harlem. I started noticing public art projects, like from artists who were grappling with the issue of climate change. And I started noticing that art in a different way because of the publication of the 2018 IPCC report, which had kind of awakened me and alerted me to understanding the level of urgency and some of the language that perhaps I had been ignoring or not knowing how to comprehend or read prior to that point. Specifically, I felt really arrested by and intrigued by a billboard that appeared in a park near the college where I teach. It was a kind of billboard that electronic billboard you normally see on the highway, that's telling you things like, beware icy conditions ahead. But this billboard was placed in the middle of a park. And unspooling on the billboard were like terrifying messages about climate refugees and climate change and the ways in which, we're in really deep water. And I just stood before the sign feeling very humbled and very afraid and wondering who put this sign here and why? What is this sign meant to do? And doing some research, uncovered a little bit more about the artist and that project and its purpose was to make New Yorkers really wrestle with and grapple with some of the things that you're grappling with and wrestling with in Miami, namely sea level rise. Like we need to think about the fact that the sea is rising, that we're a coastal city, that so much of our property is threatened. So many lives are threatened and people are already dying. In fact, this is not, as Vanessa said, a future issue or eventuality, but something that is affecting people now. We just had people, in my community who drowned in their basement apartments during Hurricane, was it Irma? Earlier this fall. So I took it upon myself to really feel like this art was a gauntlet thrown down for me to grapple with, and decided to write about it. I uncovered or discovered that this billboard was one of 10 billboards placed around the 5 boroughs of New York City. And I decided to visit all of them and really research and understand the ways that these signs, which are strategically placed in places, communities like mine that are most threatened by the climate crisis, to understand the individual ways that those distinct neighborhoods within our large city were under threat, and to write about it, right? Like to use my tool as a writer, to amplify the data, and also from a human level, as Vanessa talked about too, that I think there is great power, not only in sharing data points, which is often what scientists are called to do, but as writers and storytellers to share or make that personal connection and story, right? That if I can speak to an audience as a mother to say, this is where I live, this is how climate change is affecting my community, and this is why scientifically this is happening, and this is what that might mean for my children. Now, it might invite other people who are parents to consider the ways or understand, begin to grapple with the ways that their children are also threatened, right? So that's an example of one thing I wrote. Another thing I wrote was a lengthy diary that I spent the entire year of 2019 just chronicling, copying down things that people in my network, both online and in person, were saying about how climate change is affecting their reality. So because I live in a global city, because I'm privileged enough to be able to travel a lot for work, to go to writing conferences and things, I get to hear a lot of different perspectives from people from different places. And I ask them all the same question: how is the climate crisis affecting you in your life and in your body, right? And I was inspired to ask that question by the climate scientist Katharine Hayhoe, who says that she feels one of the most important things we can do, right? This is a question, as Vanessa said, that people are often asked who work in climate. What can I do? According to Katharine Hayhoe, one of the most important things you can do is talk about it. And the reason why talking about it, and for me, that's also writing about it, is important is that, at least in our nation, there's a big gap between the number of people who are concerned about, aware of, and appropriately frightened by the climate crisis, and the number of people who actually speak about it with any degree of regularity or even at all. That is known as, a gap that needs to be closed to begin with. Also because politically speaking, we need political will in terms of action. And politicians understand what matters to their constituents when their constituents speak and often speak with anger, right? Or clarity or desperation about these issues. So, I spent a year just copying down what people were saying about how it's affecting them in their lives. And in that way was able to make some of the kinds of connections that Vanessa makes in her work between people living in different places, like for Vanessa across the continent, experiencing divergent but also very similar problems. For example, I was able to hear and chronicle and copy down and present in this essay what my friend Danielle, who lives in the Bay Area in California, is saying about the threat of forest fires, increasing, smoke and the threat of fire to the lives of her children. And I was able to compare that with what my friend Sujatha, who lives in Sydney, Australia, was saying, more or less in the same words, right? And able to compare that with what a friend in Lebanon was saying about fires and the threat of smoke inhalation. Just to understand that no matter where we're standing, and no matter who we are, this now affects us all. And also, as Vanessa is saying, to really, really pay attention to and comprehend and process and react appropriately to the fact that not all of us are contributing to this problem in the same way. So yes, privileging voices from communities that are most affected is extremely important. And as a writer, I feel increasingly more compelled to make space, even as an editor, for example, for other mothers to speak about their terror and their hopes and their concerns for their children, not only from New York, the United States, where I'm from, but from all over the world. So this issue that I'm editing for the Kenyan Review, which is a literary magazine, is called Angry Mamas. And it's just a place for writers, women who are writers, but women from all over the world who are writers, to talk very frankly and in whatever kind of words they need to use, to fight, right? To speak as a mama bear on behalf of their kids.
Thank you so much, Emily. As you all were talking, I was capturing some notes. And some of the things that I heard is if we can't get to the platform, we'll create our own platform for ourselves. Climate is more than just weather, more than just statistics. It has a bigger picture, stories, lived experiences. And also respecting the mama bear. That's a real thing. That is a huge thing. And just the fact that, Emily, you learning about the climate crisis actually radicalized you because you wanted to make sure that your children survived and also other children survived. And I was just thinking through some of the folks that I love to read their writings here in the U.S., but Zora Neale Hurston, she said, Mama exhorted her children at every opportunity to jump at the sun. We may not land on the sun, but at least we got it off the ground. And also Shirley Chisholm said, if they don't give us a seat at the table, we're going to bring us a folding chair. You get what I'm saying? So I just love the fact that it's so many nuggets that came out of it. And then I just think about how we know that the folks that are being the most impacted by the climate crisis is not causing it. As a matter of fact, one of the statistics that always stick out to me is that one American uses as much energy as 370 Ethiopians. That is a real thing. That is a huge thing in the United States. And we know that people that's on the continent of Africa, people in South America, places like the Caribbean islands, these are not the people that are causing the climate crisis, but they are definitely the people who are the most directly impacted. So thank y'all so much for that. That was a great way to open us up. So I have a question here, Emily. Here in the U.S., you have been writing and using visual art to make connections between urban Black communities, nature, and the climate crisis. Can you tell us about those connections a little?
Yeah, I spoke a little bit about that one art project that I felt really inspired by. I mean, that's what drew me into climate writing, was seeing these billboards, right? But I also I guess, I had already been writing about public art in the community. So that wasn't a new strategy for me. I had written previously, a few years before that piece, I had written about this series of murals called the Know Your Rights murals that also appeared strategically in the places in New York City most affected by police brutality, right? So the places where Black and brown bodies, usually men, were stopped and frisked. And these murals were placed in those communities where that was happening inordinately, in order to let people know what their rights were, their Second Amendment rights. So they were beautiful murals, like visually interesting to look at. And, just like making the street into a museum, but actually offering practical information for people to know, not only what your rights are, but one of your rights is that you can record police brutality happening in front of you with your phone, and you cannot be legally, you're not supposed to be told you can't do that, right? Or have your cell phone taken away. So these murals were not only allowing people to, or informing people of their Second Amendment rights, but also encouraging people to be citizen witnesses of police brutality, right? So I have been writing about those murals, and out of the keen interest in social justice, and also, again, like selfishly as a mother, like wanting my children to my Black children to understand that information and the difficult conversations we had to have surrounding race and the ways that the police might apprehend them and what to do. But I see those two projects, right? Like the project of warning people about climate and the project of warning people about how to protect themselves from police who are ostensibly there to protect them, as being parallel, right? This is about public safety. And I'm really interested in the ways that artists try to communicate that to people, because art, visual art, I think even more than writing, is just a medium that everybody can take in and comprehend and appreciate when it's public art, when it's not in a museum, but it is on the street. Another project that I've written more recently about that I find very beautiful, it's an ongoing project in Harlem and Washington Heights, which are two neighborhoods, for those who don't know, that are in northern Manhattan, upper Manhattan, Black and Latinx predominant communities. And this other art project is, again, a series of murals representing birds. And they are the very birds that John James Audubon, the famous American ornithologist, painted a long time ago in his compendium, Birds of America. He used to live in Upper Manhattan. So this is a project where you see those birds appearing all over buildings. There are to date over 300 of those birds, maybe even closer to 400 at this point. And the point of this project is to depict all of the North American birds that John James Audubon chronicled in Birds of America as a painter, that are now threatened to be extinct by the year 2080 because of climate change. So they're very beautiful, but they're also endangered. And I felt like this is an interesting project that's, on the one hand, environmental, but on the other is unspooling in an environment where a lot of the people who live here are also endangered, particularly by environmental factors and even by gentrification. And I wanted to make connections between the birds and the Black and brown bodies that move through those neighborhoods where those birds are appearing, just to draw out those connections. Like, well, why is it that oftentimes people are more moved by stories about the threats posed by the climate crisis to polar bears or to birds than they are to the threats posed to Black and brown bodies by police brutality and by environmental racism. So just trying to make some connections between social and environmental injustice, using images of those birds, which are very beautiful, as a tool to tell a compelling story, and also to go deep in terms of drawing connections. I am interested too in documenting public art in my writing, and as a photographer, I use pictures of these art projects, knowing that they're ephemeral. Something like a mural or a public art project placed in a park isn't going to be there forever. It's making a statement and a comment that's just for a limited amount of time. Something like a mural is going to be affected by graffiti, weather, change of hands of businesses, right? Like, so documenting the ways that people are, particularly artists, are protesting and commenting on these issues is something I'm also very interested in doing as a citizen who lives in the communities where that art is forming, but also, as somebody who wants to document that work and share it with other people who don't live in my community.
Thank you so much for that, Emily. That was really, really helpful. And I don't think people really understand sometimes how art can be used as a form of activism. And it's super important, especially when it relates to capturing our history. Vanessa, so you've been doing a lot of incredible work around pushing back against anti-Black and very specifically anti-African racism in your activism, against the erasure of your voice in your people. And here in the U.S., people of African heritage are also fighting for Black lives here and internationally. Just wondering, like, what are some things that you think Black people in the United States can do better when it comes to being in solidarity with brothers and sisters and our siblings that still is on the continent? Like, how can we better flank you all in the work that you all are doing?
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to say that, the fight for Black Lives Matter is a fight for climate justice, because we know how so many Black and Brown communities are being disproportionately affected by climate change, not just on the African continent, but even in the global North. We see how Black communities are in residences that are prone to climate disasters because of the housing or because of the infrastructure, the fossil fuel infrastructure in those spaces that make, the air polluted or the water polluted, that people, the water that people need for their survival or the air that is needed ends up being polluted, exacerbating challenges and diseases like asthma in so many Black children. So I think, what I would say is for the people in the United States to know that, the fight for Black Lives Matter is a fight for climate justice. And for those, who are, working mainly in climate spaces or environmental spaces, to also learn that the fight for climate justice is a fight for Black Lives Matter. Because, when we demand, for a clean or a sustainable planet with no harm from air pollution or water pollution, or in general fossil fuel projects, it means that so many people who are already being impacted right now can have a present and a future that is cleaner, that is healthier. And like I've said, since, the bigger percentage of the people on the front lines are Black people, then when we have climate action, when we have climate justice, it will be for all of us, for the Black people. And, the other thing is for people to understand how all these things are interconnected, because someone may think that all these causes are separate, all these fights are separate, but in a way they are all connected, because a win here is a win, in another place. if it's poverty eradication, if we have climate justice, then we can eradicate poverty, because climate change is leaving millions of people in extreme poverty and keeping families in poverty traps. If it's, health justice, if we are to achieve climate justice, that means, we will have health justice. People don't have to fall sick, because of polluted water, or because of polluted air, or because they cannot access health facilities, and if it is gender equality or, racial justice, for all of us to know that when we have climate justice, then in the end, we will have gender equality, because we know how climate change is affecting so many women and girls, across the world. And we've seen in the climate spaces, when we are to talk about climate justice and racial, justice, they're also, connected. And when we go in depth about, how the injustices in the climate and the injustices in race really interconnect, it goes from who is being impacted right now, to who is responsible and who is being listened to. Again, we know that, the African continent is on the front lines of the climate crisis, but it's not on the front pages of the world's newspapers. So many activists still face, a challenge of being listened to. We saw at the COP26 in Glasgow how, many African activists weren't able to attend the COP because of reasons such as not being able to access accreditation, not being able to access funding, not being able to access vaccines. So we start to understand that even vaccine inequity affects climate justice. And we start to understand that when there is vaccine equity, then there is climate justice, because when some activists weren't able to go to the COP, it was because they couldn't access vaccines. And why? Because they're not in their countries, because they're not there in the continent. So I think it's for all of us in the United States, in Europe, across the world, to know that whatever cause that we are fighting for, it is all interconnected, and we are all fighting for a better future for everyone.
Thank you so much for that. One of the things that we've been talking about here at the Movement for Black Lives is exactly that. Last year, we noticed that a lot of Black nations were not allowed to go to COP because of vaccine apartheid and not having access to resources. And that's one of the good things about that question, was to see how we could better assist, especially as Black people in the U.S., in our access to resources in these other things. And as we are preparing for COP27, that's something we're thinking about right now. Like, how do we, help Vanessa and all the other amazing activists that's still on the continent to get to COP27? How do we make sure that, we flank other folks from other parts of the global South to be able to access these rooms and have access to participate? Vanessa, your hand is up.
Yeah, I would really to come in on that. As, Rise Up movement, we are really working to see that many activists across Africa are able to go to, the COP27, and this will mean, accreditation to be able to get in these spaces at the COP itself, and funding for activists, and, access to vaccines. So those are some of the things that we are, really working on, especially on the issue of accreditation, because we can be able to get funding, but if there is no accreditation, then, the activists can be able to go to Egypt, but they can't access, the COP venue because of the lack of accreditation. So I think, that is one of the, ways that activists from Africa can be supported when it comes to COP27 in Egypt, because we can't have COP on African soil and African land, and it's, being dominated by white people flying in from the global north, and yet the people from the African continent are not in these spaces. So I'm really glad to hear that those are some of the the areas that you're thinking of in supporting different activists from Africa.
Absolutely. And we could definitely talk after this, Vanessa. I'll make sure to get your information because we're going to make sure of it. And as we move through, I know we've been on the call for a while now. We've been on this panel, and just wondering if you all had any questions for each other around the work that you all are holding.
Yeah, I guess I have a question for you, Vanessa. We come from different generations. I'm from Generation X. What are you? I believe Generation Z? Is that the generation?
I'm not sure at all.
My point is that I think people, when they're at different points in their lives, also, we're talking about access in many ways to these spaces. I'm thinking also about at different points in our lives, activism may look different depending on our circumstances. And I think it's important to acknowledge the different ways that people can be active, right? And I was thinking of you, Vanessa, knowing we were going to talk together today. Last week, when somebody on Twitter, and I'm very active in climate Twitter, somebody in climate Twitter who was of a younger generation asked, where are all of the Generation X people in these spaces? Like, they're not here, Why is that? And there was a long string of people responding with guesses and conjecture about the absence of people from my generation from these realms. Not to be stereotyped that there's complete absence, but right, there is I would say, I think necessarily, perhaps appropriately, and maybe this has always been the way, the radical change. We hear the voices from the loudest voices, perhaps the most prominent and important voices come from youth. But I also, in this string, people were sharing from the perspective of an older generation too. Some of the obstacles to being in those visible in those spaces are physically present in those spaces, while at the same time offering things that are being done and can be done by people who, perhaps owing to the fact that they're in the sandwich, this is called the sandwich generation, caring for children, at the same time caring for elderly parents, might not have the ability to go to a meeting, right? But at the same time might be in a financial position to be able to give to an activist of Vanessa's generation or on the continent. She just had a very specific call for a need that I think somebody from my generation who may not be able also to get on an airplane and go to that space because of their own, busy life, career, job things, but might have the access and the privilege to be able to support a younger person to do it. That is also an activist act. It's recognizing what you can and cannot do. Also, I think many of us are moved to act locally. And that's beautiful and necessary too, right? To be globally conscious and concerned, but to act locally and to be very aware of and involved with whatever that means. It might mean giving money instead of time. It might mean giving both, right? It might mean amplifying voices, things that are happening in one's local community to support and amplify those efforts. And amplification can look like financial support. It can look like, just talking about it. Like I said before, sharing the voices with other people in one's community, sharing knowledge. So yeah, I guess it's something I was thinking about in preparation for this conversation with Vanessa, feeling very different in many ways, in terms of the kinds of things that we're doing based on generation, right? And place and all these and privilege and all these things, but also at root coming from the same place of concern and fear and hope. And I also wanted to hear what Vanessa might have to say, also just as a young person about, there's this other element too, right? Like some people are going to die before others and have less skin in the game than somebody who's really young and genuinely terrified about their ability, even the ethics around some of my students. I teach climate writing. I didn't mention that, but I've also altered not only the things I write about, but the things I teach entirely to be about this, because I would feel remiss if I wasn't bringing this content into a university setting. Like, what are we learning if not about this, and how to solve this, and how to talk about this, and how to confront this together? And my students who are in their early 20s or late teens, many of them are questioning whether or not it's ethical to have children, right? This is the level of urgency. And so I'm interested to hear Vanessa speak also from the standpoint of her generation, you know, of from the position of youth and what that affords her in terms of power and urgency as a public speaker on this issue. And also, the power of youth behind activism, right? It's a different thing to be an activist as a young, like, strong soldier than it is to be an activist, you know, as a middle-aged mother, I have to say. I mean, there's a lot that says fire is the same, but how the fire like lives and expresses itself, I think, can be quite different. And I just wanted to acknowledge that and ask Vanessa to speak from her position as a young person.
Yeah, thank you so much, Emily. She really mentioned quite a number of things, and I'll try to just say something on each of the things that you talked about. And one of the things was, you know, about how activism can be different, you know, for so many people. And I've always told people that not everyone has to get a climate placard or a climate sign and go to the street, you know, because some people may not be comfortable with doing that. Or some people may be in spaces or in countries whereby it's not safe for them to hold a climate sign and go to the street. So I think it's really important for people to appreciate that activism comes in different ways and not just going to the streets. And I have personally been in places whereby a journalist has asked me, many of them have asked me why I call, you know, my strikes climate strikes, and yet I'm not missing school to strike. So there was this whole picture of how a climate strike should be, that students or children are supposed to miss school, and then that is what makes it a climate strike. But for some of us, when we started the climate strikes, we were finishing university. You know, some of us were missing work to strike, but the people had a picture of what a climate strike really is. And to me, I felt like that was erasing the work that we were doing, because it wasn't matching what our fellow activists were doing in European countries, you know. And to also give, you know, another scenario or example of what I've experienced. When I started activism, a couple of months, I started to speak to my friends from university. Many of us were in our early 20s, 20, 21, 22, and asking them to join the climate movement, to also join the climate strikes. And many of them would tell me that, but the movement is talked about as one that is led by teenagers and for only teenagers, because at that time, media was reporting about the climate movement as one that is led and one that is for teenagers. So many of them felt like they couldn't be a part of the movement because it was only for teenagers. And yet we were in our early 20s. So I asked them, we can call ourselves Youth for Future. We still do the climate strikes, you know, but this can give you and I the feeling of the inclusion in the climate movement, even though we are not teenagers who are dropping out of school. And we continue to do our activism. They started to join activism and to go with me. We started to go to different schools, different communities, reaching so many people and telling them about the work that we do and why we do it. So it's important that people appreciate that activism comes in different ways. Not everyone will miss school. Not everyone will go to the street. But the important thing is the message that we are all putting across. The message can be the same, but the methods to communicate that message may be different. You know, you may find someone and, for example, they are, a lawyer, and they're using, their occupation as a lawyer to help in drafting laws or environmental policies, or to help activists in court. Because in the end, we also need the courts, we need the lawyers, we need the judges to help us, to help us secure a better future for all of us. Because we've seen how activists have taken different environmental cases to courts. When we see teachers like you, Emily, someone may not see you on the street, but you're teaching someone, you're teaching a student, you're teaching a child about the climate. You're teaching them how to talk about it, how to communicate. That is something, that is activism, because the person you're teaching is going to be tomorrow's campaigner. The person you're teaching is going to be tomorrow's scientist. The person you're teaching is going to be tomorrow's judge. So they will have an experience from your teaching that the climate needs to be protected, that the environment needs to be protected. And if they're a judge, or they become a teacher, or they become a scientist, or they become a campaigner, whatever they do, it will be for the, it will be for the betterment of the planet, of the future, and for the people. So I think activism comes in all sorts of ways. And when people put, specific ways of doing activism, it actually keeps the climate movement, because people will feel like if I can't do the strike, then I can't do anything, So we need to avoid gatekeeping the climate movement by putting house of our activism can be. If someone strikes, that is perfect. If someone uses the courts, that is perfect. If someone just signs petitions, that is perfect. If someone teaches, that is perfect. Because in the end, we are all looking at one thing. We are all looking at one vision, and that is climate justice. So the methods may be different, but the end, the destination that we are all looking at, to me, that's what really matters. And, you also talked about the older generation and the younger generation. I think that there is a power of the youth in doing activism and speaking about these issues. It's very powerful, but I think about something that is beyond power of the youth to power of all of us, the power of all of us, because we all need each other. We all need each other in addressing climate issues. We need an intergenerational conversation. Sitting here and being on a panel with you, Emily, there are things I have learned from you. So I think that it's important that if we want climate justice, then we must accept and invite intergenerational conversations, because there is so much to learn from those older than us. And there is so much to learn from those younger than us. I am older than some activists as well, but I learned from them. I learned from their speeches. I learned from their opinion pieces. I learned from their interviews. So I think that being in that place of being ready to learn, regardless, of the age or generation of the person, I think that is one of the pathways that we need to climate justice. So we don't just look at the power of the youth, but to look at the power of all of us. Because in the end, it's beyond the power of the youth. it's the power of the people, and people include all of us. So regardless of who you are, you're needed in ensuring that we have a safer, a healthier, and a more sustainable future and planet, for all of us. And you talked about, some people who may not be impacted right now. And while the younger people will be impacted, one of the things that, I have talked about is the need for leaders or for governments or for corporations to think of their children, because you may not be affected indirectly, but your children could be affected. Your grandchildren could be affected. So I always remind people that climate change will affect all of us. Some of us may be affected directly. But if you are not affected directly, your child could be affected. Your grandchild could be affected. Your generation could be affected. Your culture or your history could be affected. I think that is one of the things that I think are important to keep reminding governments or leaders or corporations to think of their children, to think of their grandchildren, to think of the generations coming after them, if they can't think of those who are being impacted right now.
Thank you so much for that. I appreciate you all so much. This conversation has been so powerful, so full of information, and so grounded in community, which is one of the most important things to me as an organizer, making sure that people know that climate justice, although it's tied to climate, although it's tied to weather and statistics, that is a very human issue. It's human cause. It's going to be human solution, and it is humans who are going to be impacted by it the most, especially our communities and our families and friends who are a part of populations or in geographical areas that are not as respected and well resourced as others. And I, want to just take us into this next piece. And I'm going to ask you all 2 questions at one time, and each of you will answer these questions if you feel like it. So one, I would like for each of you to just give us a quick rundown of what projects we should be looking out for from each of you. And also, how do we find you all on social media? Emily, you want to go first?
Yeah, as you mentioned when you introduced me at the beginning, I have a book coming out. I'm so excited to read Vanessa's book and to teach it. I have a book coming out that's called Lessons for Survival, and it's about the intersection of environmental and social justice from the perspective of motherhood. And I can be found on social media, on Twitter, and as well as Instagram, at Emily Rabatu is my handle. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I'm working on a project that involves the installation of solar panels and eco-friendly cookstoves in schools in Uganda. And this is a project that I started in 2019 to help communities transition, especially schools, transition to renewable energy, because we always talk about renewable energy, but many times people forget that not everyone can access it or even afford it. So through this project, we are able to bring renewable energy to schools, especially in the rural areas, and also to construct eco-friendly cookstoves. Over 90% of the schools in my country use firewood for preparation of food, and the eco-friendly cookstoves are an alternative that don't completely eliminate the use of firewood, but reduce on the use of firewood for preparation of food. And through this project, I'm happy to say that we've done installations in 15 schools so far, and we hope to work on as many schools as possible. And my social media is Vanessa Nakate on all platforms. Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. If you all are listening to this panel, y'all make sure y'all stay on the lookout on how y'all can support these amazing leaders in all of their existing work and upcoming work. Y'all follow them on social media so y'all can get all the updates, because we want to make sure that we're supporting all of the great work that we have going on. And lastly, for each of you, if you all could give a message, a closing message to our listeners, what would it be?
I would just share the same piece of advice that was important for me to hear from Dr. Catherine Hayhoe, which is talk about it. But in addition to that, amplify the voices of others.
Well, for me, it is faith, hope, and love, and the greatest of those three being love, because many times when you're in the climate movement, you always get frustrated by decisions of leaders or corporations, and there is a need to have hope and faith that the future that we want is not only necessary, but it's actually possible. So for me, faith and hope is one of my strengths in doing activism, and to believe that the kind of future that we want is possible. And love is one of the things that sustains us in movements and keeps us going stronger and stronger, and believing that people and the planet, ecosystems will be protected in the end. And it is what drives us to do what we do personally. It's one of the things that drives me to do what I do. So even when things seem not to be going the way that we want them to go, but there is a certain love for people and the planet and creation in general that keeps you fighting and believing that it's possible.
Thank you all so much. I really appreciate learning about your stories and all of the great work that you all do. And also, I am so grateful for your rigor, your hard work over the years, and your leadership around the world to make sure that we have an actual earth to live on in the future. In closing, I just want to remind folks that I'm Valencia Gunder. Most folks just call me V. I use she, her pronouns is Valencia Gunder on all platforms. And I want to close with this one quote. All of the issues we fight for mean nothing if we do not have an earth to inhabit. We only got one, y'all. We don't have a plan B. Ain't nowhere to go outside of that. I mean, some people trying to move to Mars, but I ain't going there. Okay. We need to protect this rock that we floating on right here. Okay. So you all stay rigorous. Stay in the fight. Let's continue to fight for our earth that we all need. And remember that everybody deserves to have safe, healthy access to the resources they need to survive. Thank you all.
This is a global warning about global warming, climate change.
Us, we must change. We must save. We must change. We must save.
And the only thing we can do to make it change is if we make a change in our lifestyles.
My son's belly and my pockets are making demands. The sun's deadly, no droplets are raining on my plants. Chance of war, go into battle with the pastoralists. No chance they're feeding cattle while we look for growth catalysts.
wilderness, patterns becoming irregular. Food used to be plenty, now migration's irregular. Polluted atmospheres like the future don't matter. Forced to move out in a search for greener pastures.
As a blood African, this is a calling set to all my fellow earth inhabitants. Global climate change affecting our environment. Traumatic devastations of poverty, shrinking continents.
See. I suppose they got our lungs all choked up, we can't breathe. They got the sky all smoked up, we can't see. This is more than global warming. This is a global emergency.
I so long for the day where we take responsibility for the things that we do and their effect on our environment. I like sunsets, snow where it's supposed to be. We need to get a handle on this global warming business, y'all.
Walking to Shamba, hand on my panga, trying to survive hunger, covered emissions, mothered villagers cry, no water to drink, and we'll die for what you used to. Wash your fists in the sink.
Yo me guregi jumentan, yo me guregi arangishu, yo me guregi enda, yo ejo yo en babjogol, kore obango yangalani, kore obango yangalani. Yo me guregi jumentan, yo me guregi arangishu, yo me guregi enda, yo ejo yo en babjogol. Kore obango yangalani, kore obango yangalani.
Whose world is this? Whose world is this one? So-called how the earth heating up. We too busy surviving and in a rush. Braiding sweetgrass reeds to love a place is not enough. So what we gon' do? Whose world is this? Whose world is this one? You, me, we all gon' lift our voices and shift something. I know it's hard to pay attention. Gotta get the money, pay the bills, and rent is tempting to check out. But we gotta come tap in. This our mama that we talking about, the odds are stacked in. So what? Ain't a problem we can't solve. It's time to show up, time to rise, we seen the fall. Felt the bottom, tasted the rage and the discouragement. Had to take all the mistreatment and we hurting this. Not an alternative, but to turn and face the world we living in. Baby, it's burning and it's burning quick. But we learning shit, and I'm certain it's worth working to heal up the planet and make a lasting shift. Whose world is this? Whose world is this one? You, me, we all gon' lift our voices and shift something. Whose world is this? Whose world is this one? You, me, we all gon' lift our voices and shift something. Same solutions to climate change could help end oppression. Picture no racism, sexism, classism pressing. Down and separated movements taking lives of people. That world we could build it, one that's fully peaceful. Red, black, and green New Deal. Black people's climate agenda, we finna make it real. Transforming water, energy, and land, it's time to heal. Shifting labor, economy, democracy gon' be our legacy. Them corporations hella greedy, why they tryna master truth? Frontline communities hit the hardest. artists, look at the proof. How 40 to 70% of COVID deaths is black when we 22% of the pop. Do the math, but there's power in the people, 99 to 1. Simple, not easy, we could win it. We just begun, we facing down history. This humanity's biggest threat, but there's beauty in the battle, baby. It ain't over yet, yeah. Whose world is this? Whose world is this one? You, me, we all gon' lift our voices and shift something. Whose world is this? Whose world is this one? You, me, we all gon' lift our voices and shift something. Whose world is this? Whose world is this one? You, me, we all gon' lift our voices and shift something. Whose world is this? Whose world is this one? You, me, we all gon' lift our voices and shift something.
This feeling, I see it.